I have to say, working for the likes of William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, and Michael Hard through those very successful years certainly taught me a few things about crisis management and why it's important that we get on the front foot to ensure we are protected when a crisis comes around. Crises do happen, and they happen to us all. And I'm a bit of a reputation geek. I spent a lot of my career working with organizations to build reputations and also protect them when the worst hits. And today, I'm going to explore that in detail. I want to do three things today. One, keep you awake. It's always the worst slot speaking to any group after lunch. Okay, so I'm going to be really challenging you, which is the second thing I'm going to do to keep you awake. And the third thing is to try and inspire you, because I sat in the last session before lunch. The work you do is extraordinary, but you're not telling anyone about it. You should be getting out there and telling the story, making the case, as Cameron and his team has said. You've got too many good pieces of news to let it stay on a PowerPoint presentation at a conference like this. And we're going to be talking more about that as we go through today. So before we start properly, who works for an organization with a good reputation? Put your hand up. Whoa. So not a very confident bunch, are we? So let's talk more about this and why it's really important that we look at reputation. You don't actually own your reputation, but it is your most valuable asset. It's owned by perception of you, by those videos you saw earlier of stakeholders, of media views, of your customers, your tenants' views as well. You don't own it. But despite the importance of it to all of us, we do so little to build it and protect it. We don't take it seriously. The reality is, we don't do this at all. And think about it. If you look at businesses out there, particularly the FTSE 100 in London, they take reputation seriously. Most of them have someone at an executive level who's responsible for reputation. Every boardroom will discuss reputation at every single meeting. Every business school out there in the world is looking at corporate reputation very, very seriously. Harvard, everywhere. Oxford's business school, the SAD business school, has got its own center of corporate reputation. So now ask yourself, why are you not looking at reputation seriously every time you get together as a senior team? Because reputation really matters. And one day there'll be an algorithm for the link between market value for companies and reputation. When that algorithm's there, it'll also work for other organizations. And there'll be no excuse, because the numbers will be very, very tangible. So get ahead of the curve, not behind it, and make sure you're doing something about it. Because the reality is, most of us deal with bad news like this. Do you all recognize this? When a bad news story hits, 9/10 cleanup, 1/10 prevention. And I know a lot of people in this room, when they do engage with the press, engage in bad ways. They get a call and they have an argument. But you've got to put your head above the parapet outside of those arguments. You've got to be speaking to the press outside of crises to raise your reputation, just like you should be speaking to your stakeholders. People who are worried to put their head above the parapet, I always like to say to them, imagine if you were giving advice to a married couple who were only speaking when they ride. What would you tell them? You'd tell them to speak outside the rise, wouldn't you, and build that relationship back? So that's what you've got to be doing out there, and you've got such good news. I've seen some of it today, the fantastic work about going in regard to loan sharks with them. Today, that's a story nationally in terms of people not being able to get off the poverty line. That should be the case study they're using on the BBC News tonight. There's no reason why it couldn't be if it's done in the right way. So you've got the stories. It's now time to start using them. So Warren Buffett once said it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to wreck it. And most people agree with that. I actually don't. I believe that organizations have reputation gaps, hence mind the gap. And the gap is between what they're saying they're doing and what they're actually doing operationally. And every single organization in the world has got this gap. PR companies have it, you have it, big global organizations have a lot of them. And the reality is, the bigger that gap, when you face a crisis, the worse the reaction will be and the more impact it will have, the crisis will have on you. Now let's look at this through the prism of BP. We all remember the Deepwater Horizon crisis, yes? It's still going on. They're still facing court case after court case in terms of compensation. Does anyone here disagree that their response to that crisis led to a real damage, a real impact on their reputation? What do you remember about their response? Defensive, yeah. Well, let's have a look.
Sunday, BP's CEO apologized.
We're sorry, actually. We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, you know, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back.
Life here may never be the same. The water and all that lives in and around it could be harmed for years. So on this holiday weekend, some people in New Orleans protested.
We're trying to clean up this mess.
I'm filled with anxiety every night, and I hope that the BP executives feel the same way. Unfortunately, I doubt that they do.
So it wasn't a great response, was it? You wouldn't necessarily write that line if you were a crisis communications advisor, would you? And it led to a whole host of viral sites online which really damaged BP. But the reality was it wasn't the response which did the most damage. It was the reputation gap they had. They didn't have a reputation gap here in Europe, per se. They probably had a little one, but it wasn't huge. But in the States, they had a huge reputation gap because for many years over there, they've been taking on ExxonMobil in their own backyard. They'd be going out there and buying businesses, trying to become the biggest and the best in America. So stakeholders were very nervous about them. And at the same time, they were, if you remember, greening oil. They were changing from being an oil company to an energy company. They were making it a safer company and making sure that their pipelines were robust and weren't going to be corroded. Yet, when they were doing that, people were dying in the Texas oil refinery, explosion which killed people. They had spills in Alaska in Prudhoe Bay because they weren't putting enough checks in place for corroded lines. So what they've been saying and what they were doing did not add up, and this gap was huge. So when this happens, they're fair game in my view. Absolutely fair game. Now we mightn't have seen it through that prism because we're over here and we like BP and they seem to be a good organization that, you know, their shares impact pensions so much. But this was the problem in the States. And I want to ask you all, have you audited your reputation gap? And if you haven't, please make sure you do so the next time you meet. It absolutely should be a top management job to do this and ask yourself some very robust questions because it's an integral part. And it's all about leadership at the heart of it. Well-run organizations don't face crises, so you have to ensure you're insulated against the crises or don't have reputation gaps. And those that do have big reputation gaps face more crises, but you must ensure that your reputation gap is as tiny as possible. It's important to work through that. So, no excuses. We're going to be talking today about how you can fix these problems and what best practice you can put in place. So, the first question I've got for you, who owns the management of your reputation internally in your organizations? Tell me. Shout out. Who owns it? Who's? Everyone does, but who specifically owns it within the team, management team? If some people are saying management team, that worries me. Who's the individual? Fantastic, yeah, the CEO. The CEO is absolutely responsible for this. How many job descriptions for CEOs mention reputation? So go back and have a look and challenge your thinking. If possible, get it added to the job description. It's a vital component of this. You know, Gary Orr was talking earlier about, in effect, leadership and bringing the team with you and making the team get out there and feel a sense of ownership in the community. You've got to do the same for reputation, and teams have got to know who they can go to have a conversation. My second question is, how do you measure reputation? Does anyone here measure reputation at every single major meeting they have? Come on, some of you must. None of you. Okay, well that's worrying, and we're going to talk about how we can fix that. But reputation in the past has been intangible. People have said, but what is reputation? Because there's so many elements of it. There's the digital, there's the media, there's the political, there's the community, there's the operational. How do I actually measure my reputation? But as I said earlier, it's what's in the public sphere of influence that is your reputation. And it is possible now to measure that. There's this gentleman here, Alberto Lopez, who created a company called Alva. And he is making reputation tangible. They already work for a third of the FTSE. Because as I was saying earlier, FTSE companies are taking this very, very seriously. And what they do is they take all those different channels of information and data and they put it through their proprietary system to give a figure and a benchmarking. And I want to show you the results of that so you can start thinking about what you do, because you don't necessarily have to spend money to do this. You will all have data in terms of complaints, in terms of media profile, in terms of social media, in terms of meetings with politicians. You'll have all that data, and it's possible to traffic like that and create a monthly system to benchmark your reputation. But you have to do it, because doing nothing is not an option anymore. This is good management to do this. So please think about how you do it. Now, these are some of the things that they do. As you'll see here, this is the banking sector, and I'm sorry, I think someone from Barclays might be here. So I'm sorry for focusing on Barclays for a few slides. This is the banking sector back in March 2012. The first thing I would say is you need to be benchmarking yourself against people within your industry. You can't benchmark yourself against others outside it. It doesn't work like that. You've got your reputation, but the industry reputation is vitally important too. That's why it's so good to see the great work by Cameron and Jenny and the team here. But you've got to step up as well. So two things go together. You can't escape the industry trend. So if someone in your industry screws up and has a crisis, your reputation falls with them. There's lots of evidence for that. So look around this room and ask yourself, do you trust each other to protect your own reputation as an organization? Because that's the reality of it. And I think you can tell that when a crisis happens for someone else. Everyone asks questions of you. So it's really important to look at how you can work together when you can, but at the same time, you must be getting out in the front foot and creating your own reputation. So that's what Alva do with that. The other thing they do is they provide a very clear sentiment analysis, and sentiment in effect is when bad news is hitting in this instance for Barclays, or when good news is hitting. Does anyone know what happened in this period? This was Bob Diamond's remuneration issues. And as you'll see here, if we look up here, the reputation fell very, very slightly. And you might think that's not a big fall, but the reality is it is a huge fall in reputation terms. A huge fall on these sort of tables. So because of prolonged hits, the reputation started to fall. Now, the reason why this is important is because this system also allows you to look at the issues which are impacting your reputation. And in effect, this is your risk analysis. Now, how many people here, every time they meet as a management team, look at risk? Okay, a few of you, great. It's got to be done, folks. In effect, these issues are the risks for Barclays at this time. The biggest one, the one that was affecting the reputation score the most, is remuneration. And the reason why I'm showing you this slide is because if something is hitting you that badly, it leaves you with very little insulation to protect yourself and protect your reputation when something else bad comes along, because you've used up everything on that one issue. And if we look here, let's just go in a bit. If we look here, down here, LIBOR. This is before it happened. So they knew it was coming, but they couldn't do anything about it because they'd used everything up on the remuneration issue. So just think about you and how ready you are to deal with those issues as quickly as possible, because the rule is, if it's still in a news cycle for a week, you're in big trouble. If you can get rid of it in a day or two, you've dealt with it well, and the reputational damage will not be as pronounced as others think. Now, this is certainly pronounced. This is a company called Lonmin. Remember last year in South Africa, there was a terrible case of a load of miners getting shot. Remember that by the police? This was that company. And this is over quite a sustained period of time. And just look at the amount of sentiment change. Up and down, up and down, up and down. Very negative stories as well. And as a result, they've got probably the biggest ever reputational trend down for last year. Because it wasn't just the shootings which did damage to them, it was the way they were operating and everything else. And they weren't getting on the front foot. They stopped being a confident organization. And confident organisations can get through trouble, though. Here's Sainsbury. This is Sainsbury's during the Horsegate scandal, which you all remember. Unbridled disaster. Sorry. Tesco obviously had significant problems, but you look at Sainsbury's, actually they went up slightly during it, partly because of some really good results, but also because they were really, really confident in their position and said, we're going to get in the front foot and tell our story. We're going to fill the vacuum to avoid the negativity hitting us. So it is possible to get through these situations. It's not easy, don't get me wrong, but it's absolutely possible to see that little uptick. The next thing I just want to talk about is operations. And as I said earlier, it was great to hear stories about people getting out in the field, meeting tenants, seeing maintenance changes, all of that. But when that's happening, that is a great opportunity to be reporting back on risk and reputational issues. And you need to join that up. You need to be creating systems and processes, because I know you're fed up being regulated. I know compliance is a big problem for you, but this is about doing it yourself, to be proactive, to get in the front foot, and to have good, robust management systems that allow you to identify risk and use it to protect your reputation. So I always encourage people to get out there. And if your team are not getting out there in the field enough, change that. Make sure there's a reporting structure so they're not just going out to meet people, they are your eyes and ears in the field for reputational issues. Train them up. Let them see the reputation figures. The next area is keeping it integrated. Now, your third parties, these groups, are going to be what protects you in a crisis, what help raise your reputation. But so few of us use them well enough. I mentioned earlier the need to get on that front foot, and just listening to the team talk, there were so many good opportunities to get on the front foot with all these audiences. I mean, a lot of you will have small teams, so you mightn't think employee engagement is that important. Employees are the best route to understanding your own reputation. If you haven't got an annual survey, employee survey, change it and make sure there is that. But just don't make it quantitative, make it qualitative as well. Make sure there's someone independent coming in to ask questions. They will give you fantastic insight. I worked for some organizations recently who were a bit worried about their own reputation. And it was extraordinary when I went in to speak and do focus groups with their internal teams, how big a problem they had, but they just hadn't realized how bad it was. And the internal audiences knew about it from the start, but just because of the systems of management that didn't get through. A lot of the problem comes because we are using very new age internal communications techniques. We all like to communicate by email, and even LinkedIn and Twitter, etc., are used these days, and a lot of videos, etc., are used internally in organizations. And even in small teams, that creates a barrier for communications. Absolutely do that, but don't allow middle management cascades up and down to be lost. They're vitally important. People have got to be able to talk to someone, give their view, and feedback, just like you've got to be able to push messages down to teams. There's a blockage in the middle at the minute because middle management stop doing their job in terms of internal comms when they see other channels being used instead of them. So make sure everything's done first through that mechanism. So please think about how you're using these audiences to get your message out there and have success. And then the final area is just this. And this is at the heart of Cameron's message about getting out there and making the case. It's what Stephen's doing for you as well. And you are getting good coverage, really good coverage from the team here. But you've got to play a part in this. And just listening to the teams earlier giving their presentations, there were several stories that jumped out at me. The nudge theory from Gary Orr was really, really interesting. And anyone who's got a different management style or technique, that's newsworthy. It mightn't feel like it, but newspapers are really, really interested in people trying different things in localities. So use that to your advantage. We get something called Response Source in our agency, and journalists are sending out requests for information from people like you on a daily basis. I counted over 35 opportunities in the last 4 days that you could have responded to if you're willing to talk about best practice on HR, best practice on management in general, best practice in terms of community engagement. And that's what you do. And people from the Times, the Financial Times, as well as the local newspapers here, are desperate for that type of content. Most of the organizations I work with don't have great content. You've got great content just brimming through. You've got compelling stories about human nature that just are fantastic. The work you're doing to try and get people on their feet again, that's brilliant. And just by showing some foresight to say, right, what is the big economic story in the next 2 weeks? How do we link into that? How do we get you Permacross from the BBC to cover it here? Because they've got to be out in the regions. That's helpful for you. Take advantage of it. Play to what they need. Please, please, please get on the front foot. Now, the reason for doing this is because if you're facing a crisis, you want to have fought the battle before the crisis comes. And the art of war is very clear about that. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war. That's what you should all be doing. There is no option to keep your head down. Organizations that do that, I've got suspicions about, just like the public have got suspicions about, because everything we've been talking about isn't just a consumer product story. It's corporate brands. People are speaking directly to stakeholders like yourself as well. It absolutely applies to you. Just to make this real, if you look at the food sector, who have a terrible reputation, and I'm doing a lot of work with them at the minute, they really, really struggle when they're supplying white label products to supermarkets, because a lot of these companies don't think they need to have a profile. And the meat scandal proved that they did. And all the stats, by the way, all the polling shows that people want to know who's behind it anyway. But let's just have a quick look at that Horsegate scandal and just think, if you were faced with a big scandal, how are you going to come out of it if you haven't got a footprint, a positive narrative out there already?
The scandal has thrown light on the shadowy world of EU food production. Initial investigations by French officials reveal that Pujol bought frozen meat from a trader in Cyprus. The trader had received it from a Dutch food supplier who'd purchased it from 2 Romanian slaughterhouses. Back in France, Pujol supplied the meat to a Luxembourg factory where it was sold on under the Swedish-based brand Findus. It's now become a pan-European crisis. In the north of England, police and food standards inspectors raided this slaughterhouse and meat processing company suspected of selling on horse meat as beef.
Now, 2013 has been a year of food scandals in general. But these companies have not stepped up and said, this is who we are. And if you remember what happened when this broke, Larry Goodman from APP became Dirty Larry, friends of Saddam Hussein. Because he didn't have a profile, he didn't have a narrative, and when they were out there, no one was listening. And there's a key point there for you all. When you go out there to speak to the media, if you go out there to speak to stakeholders, are you truly engaging them? Are they remembering what you say? Put your hand up if you think people are remembering what you say. That's quite scary. You spend all that time working on what you want to say, what your messages are. Who's been media trained here? Great, brilliant. You've got to go beyond that. It's all very well knowing how to make sure you get your message in. The trick is to engage them so they're remembering your message. And art of engagement is such a skill, and it applies to whether you're speaking to a mass group of people, whether it's on television, or whether it's with a print journalist one-on-one, or even an employee one-to-one. Because I always say to people, how many times have you asked an employee to do something, but they've not done it? Whose fault is it? Yours for not communicating right, or theirs for not listening? Because we don't listen. So we've got to try really hard to make sure people listen to us when we speak. I mean, you all bright people, what do you remember someone saying on television in the last week, other than a presenter? Very little, I guess. So it's challenging you on these things. Make sure you as an organization are best in class in terms of engagement throughout the whole organization. Train people up. There's science which can guide you on this. So in essence, I'm trying to tell you that good companies and organizations don't have bad reputations. And those that do work on this will get through crises situations far better than those that don't. There's absolute evidence for that. So I want to leave you with 5 very quick thoughts. Firstly, reputation is the fastest growing area of concern for boards. They're taking it very, very seriously. If you're not, why not? And how do we change that quickly? The second thing is The measurement's now tangible. So we talked today about the systems you saw from Alva, but what can you develop? What traffic light benchmarking system can you develop, which looks at all your links externally and internally, including employee issues, customer issues, maintenance issues, PR, all of that. Think about how you can create that and bring it to your key meetings on an absolute, in a worst case scenario, a monthly basis. Personally, I'd love to see it looked at a lot more than that. And as part of that, your risk analysis needs to be there. Thirdly, please work with your employees. Find a way to listen to them. Find a way to communicate with them that works. They are brilliant for you. They've got passion for what you do. And they're on side. So let them tell you the reality. Make sure your management systems are not getting in the way. I'm sure you don't, but just go back and challenge yourselves to do that properly. And this is why it's important, because it does differentiate you. We don't want to be hanging other people in the industry out to dry. And Cameron and his great team are doing brilliant work to make sure the industry's reputation goes up. But we talked earlier about this spread from the best banks down to the bottom. You should always want to differentiate yourself and be at the top of that spread. That creates competition in the industry in a positive sense, not a negative sense. Buy into what Cameron and the team are saying, do it properly, and you can get out ahead of everyone else and be seen as best practice, because the work you're doing on a day-to-day basis is extraordinary. And don't allow this to happen. I mean, I know this from the PR and lobbying industry. There's been a lot of lobby scandals in recent months. Not one of them has come from the PR lobbying industry. It's all come from dodgy politicians. Yet, who's being regulated? The PR and lobbying industry. And the reason why they're fair game for that is because 80% of them signed up to internal codes, self-regulation, but 20% didn't. And it's the 20% that's caused this. So just think about what you're doing and how you can get forward and work together as a group. So my message to you all is that reputation matters. We've covered a lot there. I really hope what you've taken away from it is about the need for energy in terms of reputation management. You just can't leave it. And we're going to deal with questions, but so you've got my contact details. There they are. Thank you all very much.